The raiders moved through the storm like wolves themselves, though they lacked the intelligence of the beasts they mimicked. Astrid could hear them long before they saw her cabin, their labored breathing cutting through the wind, the crunch of snow beneath boots that had seen too many desperate miles. She counted their heartbeats, 6 distinct rhythms echoing in her mind like distant drums. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled with unusual colors tonight. Blues and greens danced among the orange flames, casting shadows that seemed to move independent of their sources. Astrid set down her bone needle and the sealskin she'd been mending, her fingers automatically checking the leather thong that held her carved oak leg secure. The prosthetic had been with her for 3 winters now, its intricate runic patterns worn smooth by use and weather, yet it still hummed with a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. "I know," she whispered to the darkness beyond the firelight. "I hear them too." 2 pairs of eyes materialized from the shadows, not reflecting the firelight as normal wolves' eyes would, but glowing with their own inner light. Fenris emerged first, his massive frame unfolding from behind the woodpile where he'd been resting. His coat was the color of fresh ash, and scars crossed his muzzle from battles fought in another lifetime. Skadi followed, smaller but no less formidable, her midnight black fur seeming to absorb the very light around her. The wolves moved to flank Astrid's chair, their presence as natural as breathing. She rested one hand on Fenris's broad head, feeling the familiar tingle of connection that ran deeper than mere companionship. Through that touch, she could sense what he sensed, the raiders' hunger, their desperation, and beneath it all, the cold calculation of men who'd convinced themselves that survival justified any cruelty. Astrid had been like them once, in the days when she'd carried a proper shield and her legs had been flesh and bone. She remembered the weight of a sword in her hand, the adrenaline surge of a successful raid, the way victory tasted like copper and glory. But she also remembered Hedeby, the screams, the fire, the moment Bjorn Bloodaxe's weapon had shattered her leg and her old life in a single devastating blow. The memory sparked along her wooden leg like lightning through oak, and for a moment, the runes carved into its surface glowed faintly in the firelight. She'd thought herself broken then, lying in that smoking ruin while her shield sisters, her true sisters, had died around her. She'd thought the gods had abandoned her when the fever took her leg and left her with this carved replacement. How wrong she'd been. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying new sounds. Harsh whispers in the old tongue, the scrape of steel being drawn from sheaths despite the cold that should make metal stick to skin. These weren't mere bandits seeking easy coin. These were desperate men planning violence, the kind who would take what they wanted and leave nothing but blood in the snow. Skadi's lip curled back, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished bone. The black wolf's growl was so low it was felt rather than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Astrid's other hand found the wolf's neck, and through that touch came flashes of memory, not her own but Skadi's from when she'd worn human form. Battle rage and sisterhood, the taste of mead shared by firelight, the weight of mail and the song of steel. "Soon," Astrid murmured, her voice barely audible above the storm. But not yet. The cabin had been her sanctuary for 3 years, a place where she could tend her small garden in summer, preserve meat and vegetables for winter, and exist without the weight of others' expectations or pity. The villagers in the valley below thought her mad for choosing isolation, but they didn't understand that solitude was different from loneliness. She was never truly alone. She rose from her chair with fluid grace, the wooden leg taking her weight without complaint. The prosthetic was a masterwork of carving, its surface covered in protective runes and bound with strips of leather that had been blessed by her grandmother's blood. More importantly, it had been carved from wood that had never known mortal tools, a splinter of the world tree itself, taken in payment for services rendered to things that dwelt in shadow and starlight. The fire dimmed as if sensing the change in mood, and the unusual colors in the flames intensified. Through the small window, Astrid could see shapes moving against the white backdrop of snow, 6 figures spreading out to surround her home, their movements betraying training despite their desperation. They would be upon her soon, these men who saw only a crippled woman living alone in the wilderness. They expected easy prey, perhaps imagining her begging for mercy or cowering in terror. Astrid smiled, an expression that held no warmth despite the dancing firelight. They had no idea what they'd actually found. The wolves flanked her as she moved toward the door, their eyes burning brighter in the growing darkness. Tonight, the storm would witness more than wind and snow. Tonight, it would witness a reckoning. But first, there were rituals to observe. Old habits that had kept her alive through 3 winters of isolation. Routines that anchored her to something approaching normalcy in a life that had become anything but normal. Astrid paused at the door, her hand resting on the iron latch that she'd forged herself in the cabin's small hearth. The metal was cold beneath her palm, a sharp contrast to the warmth that pulsed through her wooden leg whenever danger approached. She closed her eyes and drew a slow breath, centering herself in the moment before chaos descended. "Not yet," she whispered again, this time to herself as much as to the wolves. Let them come closer. Let them reveal their intentions fully. She turned from the door and moved through the cabin's familiar confines, her movements automatic after years of practice. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, carved into the hillside itself with rooms that extended back into the earth like a warren. What the raiders could see was merely the facade, a single-room dwelling that spoke of poverty and vulnerability. The truth was far different. In the main room where she spent her evenings, everything had its place. The bone needle and sealskin returned to their basket beside her chair. The small cauldron that hung over the fire, perpetually simmering with herbs that most would mistake for simple healing remedies. The shelves lined with preserved foods, yes, but also with things that would make a scald's blood run cold. Vials of substances that glowed with their own light, bundles of plants that grew only in graveyards, bones carved with symbols that predated the coming of the Christ God to the southern lands. Fenris padded beside her as she made her circuit, his massive paws silent on the packed earth floor. Through their connection, she felt his memories of this routine, how many nights they'd performed this same dance of preparation. The big wolf understood the necessity of readiness, just as he'd understood it when he'd worn the form of Gudrun Shieldbreaker, her sworn sister who'd fallen at Hedeby with Astrid's name on her lips. At the far wall, Astrid ran her fingers along what appeared to be random scratches in the wood. To untrained eyes, they were merely the marks of someone whiling away long winter nights. In truth, they were a calendar of sorts, not of days, but of debts. Each mark represented a service rendered to the things that dwelt beyond the veil of mortal sight. Payments made in blood and pain for the knowledge that had saved her life and bound her sister's souls to new forms. The largest mark, carved deeper than the rest, represented the night she'd traded her humanity's certainty for the power that now thrummed through her wooden leg. She traced it with one finger, remembering the cold voice that had spoken from the darkness between stars, offering her a choice: die with her sisters, or live to honor their memory in ways that would cost her more than death ever could. Scotty approached from the other side, her black form materializing from shadows that seemed too deep for the cabin's modest interior. The smaller wolf carried something in her jaws, a leather pouch that contained Astrid's most precious possessions, not gold or silver, but things far more valuable, a lock of hair from each of her fallen sisters, bound with threads spun from her own blood. A fragment of her grandmother's staff, passed down through generations of women who'd walked between worlds. And at the bottom, wrapped in silk that had never seen sunlight, a sliver of her own thigh bone, the price she'd paid for Yggdrasil's wood. Outside, the raiders were moving closer. Through the wolves' enhanced senses, Astrid could taste their intentions on the wind. Rape, certainly. Murder, most likely. They would take what little they imagined she possessed and leave her body for the crows, congratulating themselves on their easy victory over a helpless cripple. The irony was bitter as winter ale. They sought to destroy the very thing that had become her greatest treasure, not the cabin itself, but what it represented. 3 years of peace, of nights spent in communion with powers that cared nothing for human weakness, of mornings watching the sun rise over peaks that touched the realm of the gods. This was the life she'd built from the ashes of her old existence, where she could honor her sister's memories without the weight of a world that saw only her limitations. But it was a lonely life, for all its power. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, she found herself longing for simple human connection. The sound of voices raised in song around a hall fire, the warmth of skin against skin that carried no otherworldly purpose, the easy laughter of shield sisters who saw her as Astrid the Ironwill, not Astrid the witch-marked. Those longings made her weak, and weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. The fire flared green as if responding to her thoughts, and both wolves turned toward the door in perfect unison. The raiders had finished their positioning. Soon, they would make their move. Astrid smiled grimly and began to prepare for war. The first arrow shattered the silence like breaking bone. It punched through the cabin's single window with a crystalline crash, embedding itself in the far wall with a solid thunk that vibrated through the wooden frame. Ice and glass scattered across the floor in a spray of moonlight, and the winter wind came howling through the breach like a hungry ghost. Astrid didn't flinch. She'd been expecting this moment for the past hour, watching through Fenris and Scotty's senses as the raiders positioned themselves in the tree line. What she hadn't expected was the crude arrogance of it, shooting into her home like she was nothing more than a deer to be flushed from cover. "Cripple!" The voice came from beyond the shattered window, rough with cold and dark with intent. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and we might let you keep breathing." Laughter followed. 6 distinct voices joined in cruel mirth. They thought themselves clever, these desperate men who'd traveled far from whatever ruin had spawned them. They'd watched her cabin for long enough to see her limp, to count her as helpless. In their minds, they'd already won. Fenris's growl started low in his chest and built like approaching thunder. Beside him, Scotty's lips peeled back to reveal teeth that gleamed with unnatural sharpness in the firelight. Both wolves had gone rigid with barely contained violence, their eyes blazing with memories of battles fought in human forms. But it was the arrow itself that truly changed everything. Astrid pulled the shaft from the wall and studied it in the dancing firelight. Crude iron point, poorly fletched with whatever feathers they'd scavenged from the wilderness. The kind of arrow made by men who'd been running hard and living rough, who'd lost their smiths and their supplies, and their honor along whatever dark road had brought them here. Yet it wasn't the arrow's poverty that made her breath catch. It was the smell that clung to the iron, a reek of old blood and older magic that spoke of things done in darkness. This wasn't random violence. These men had been touched by something far worse than mere desperation. "Last chance, witch!" Another voice, younger than the first but carrying the same bitter edge. "We've got your hovel surrounded." Witch. The word hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. They knew. Somehow, despite her years of careful isolation, word had spread. Perhaps a villager from the valley had spoken too freely about the woman who lived alone in the high places. Perhaps the very winter winds had carried tales of green fire and wolves that walked too much like men. It didn't matter how they'd learned. What mattered was that her 3 years of peace were ending, and she faced a choice that would determine not just her survival, but the very nature of what she would become. She could run. The cabin had hidden passages carved deep into the hillside, routes that would let her escape into the wilderness with nothing but her life and her wolves. She could abandon this sanctuary and find another, perhaps in land so remote that even whispers of her nature would never reach her. It would mean starting over, building new wards, establishing new protections. It would mean letting these men believe their cruelty had been rewarded. Or she could fight as the woman she'd been, Astrid Ironwill the Shieldmaiden, relying on steel and skill and the kind of mortal courage that had once made her name ring in drinking halls from Hedeby to the Orkney Isles. 6 against 1 were poor odds, but she'd faced worse and lived to boast of it. But that woman had died in Hedeby's flames along with her sisters. What remained was something far more dangerous. The third choice whispered to her through the wooden leg that had become both burden and blessing. The power that dwelt in Yggdrasil's heartwood called to her with a voice like winter wind through standing stones. She could embrace what she'd become fully. Witch, keeper of the old ways, daughter of a bloodline that had bargained with forces older than the gods themselves. She could show these raiders exactly what they'd stumbled upon in their ignorance. Another arrow splintered through the window frame, followed by harsh laughter. Outside, she could hear them moving closer, emboldened by her silence. They thought her cowering, in terror, already defeated by their superior numbers and crude threats. Astrid set the arrow carefully on her table and turned toward the fire. The flames were burning higher now, shot through with veins of green and blue that pulsed like a living heart. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo from the dancing light, words spoken years ago about the price of power and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. The wooden leg thrummed against her thigh, warm as fresh blood despite the winter cold seeping through the broken window. Fenris and Scotty flanked her, their eyes bright with anticipation and old hunger. The raiders wanted a victim. The peaceful life she'd built was already burning. Time to give them a monster instead. But even as the thought formed, doubt crept through her like winter frost through cracked stone. Astrid's hand trembled as she reached toward the fire, stopping just short of the flames that danced, with colors no mortal hearth should hold. The warmth from her wooden leg pulsed stronger, Yggdrasil's heartwood responding to her intent, but with it came a flood of memories she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The last time she'd truly embraced her grandmother's legacy, she'd knelt in Hedeby's ruins with her dying sister's blood still warm on her hands. She remembered the taste of copper and desperation as she'd bitten her own tongue, letting her blood fall onto the smoking earth while words in the old tongue poured from her lips like poison. The ritual had worked. Gudrun and Thyra lived still, bound to wolf forms by magic that violated every natural law. But the cost? Power always demands payment, little star. Her grandmother's voice whispered from memory, edged with the bitter wisdom of a woman who'd lived too long and seen too much. The question is whether you'll choose the price, or let it choose you. Astrid jerked her hand back from the fire, her breath coming in short gasps that misted in the suddenly frigid air. Through the broken window, she could hear the raiders drawing closer, their boots crunching through snow with the confidence of predators closing on wounded prey. One of them was whistling tunelessly, a sound that spoke of casual cruelty, of men who'd done this before and found sport in others' terror. They deserved whatever fate she could weave for them. But what would she become in the weaving? Fenris pressed against her side, his massive form radiating warmth and familiar comfort. Through their bond she felt his confusion, not at the approaching danger, but at her hesitation. In the wolf's mind, the choice was simple. Threats were eliminated, pack was protected, survival was paramount. The complexities of human morality meant nothing to him now, just as they'd meant little to Gudrun in her final battle rage at Hedeby. But Scotty was different. The smaller wolf sat apart, her midnight coat seeming to absorb the firelight while her eyes held depths that spoke of retained humanity. Thyra had always been the thoughtful one, the sister who questioned orders and weighed consequences. Even in wolf form, she remembered what it meant to choose between survival and principle. "I know," Astrid whispered to the dark wolf. "I know what I'm risking." The power that thrummed through her wooden leg wasn't just magic. It was transformation. Each time she drew upon it, she became something further removed from the woman who'd once shared bread and blood with her shield sisters. Already she could feel winter's breath in her veins, could taste starlight on her tongue when the moon was dark. Her grandmother had warned her that Yggdrasil's gifts came with their own hunger, that the world tree's essence sought always to return to its source. How many more times could she use it before she stopped being Astrid entirely? A boot scraped against her door, followed by low voices conferring in the harsh dialect of the far northern clans. These weren't local bandits. They'd traveled far to find her, drawn by rumors and whispers that had somehow spread despite her careful isolation. That meant others would come after them, and others after those. Her sanctuary was already compromised. The peaceful life she'd built was ending whether she fought or fled. But fighting meant embracing what she'd tried so hard to control. The power her grandmother's bloodline had passed down through generations of wise women came with a price that accumulated like blood debts. Each spell cast, each ritual performed, each bargain struck with entities that dwelt beyond mortal understanding. All of it carved away pieces of her humanity until only the hunger for more power remained. She'd seen it happen to her grandmother in those final years. The way the old woman's eyes had gone cold as winter stars, how she'd spoken of people as though they were pieces on some vast game board. By the end, even her love for Astrid had seemed distant, filtered through calculations of magical potential and inherited obligation. "There's still time," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she spoke to herself, her wolves, or the spirits that always seemed to lurk just beyond perception in this place. "I could run. We could all run." But even as the words left her lips, she knew them for lies. Running would only delay the inevitable. These raiders weren't the disease, they were merely symptoms of a larger rot that had been spreading through the northern lands for years. Christian priests burning sacred groves, jarls abandoning the old ways for Roman gold, the ancient compacts between human and spirit fraying like poorly woven cloth. Someone had to stand against it. Someone had to remember what was being lost. The wooden leg pulsed once, twice, like a second heartbeat. Outside, steel rang against steel as weapons were readied for slaughter. Time was running out. Astrid stepped toward the fire with deliberate finality, her wooden legs striking the packed earth floor like a war drum marking time. Each footfall sent vibrations through Yggdrasil's heartwood, awakening power that had slumbered fitfully for 3 long years. "Enough," she said, and the word carried weight beyond its simple sound. The flames responded, leaping higher with colors that had no names in mortal tongues, deep purples that spoke of midnight between stars, greens that whispered of spring's first breath on winter-killed earth, blues that sang with the voice of glacial ice-grinding stone to dust. The raiders outside her door had given her a gift without knowing it. They'd made the choice simple by taking all other options away. She could cling to the illusion of humanity and die with it, or embrace what her bloodline had always demanded she become. Behind her, Fenris rose to his full height, his hackles bristling with anticipation. The great wolf's eyes had begun to glow with the same unnatural light that danced in the flames, and his growl deepened into something that resonated in frequencies below human hearing. Skadi joined him, her smaller form coiled like a spring, though her midnight eyes held reservations that echoed Astrid's own fading doubts. "I'm sorry," Astrid whispered to them both, though she wasn't certain what she apologized for, the choice she was making, or the woman she was about to stop being. She reached into the fire with her bare hand. The flames didn't burn. Instead, they flowed up her arm like liquid starlight, seeping into her flesh and bone until her very blood began to sing with borrowed power. The sensation was overwhelming, every nerve in her body suddenly alive to currents of force that flowed beneath the visible world like underground rivers of pure possibility. Through her wooden leg, she felt Yggdrasil's vast consciousness stirring from its eternal contemplation. The world tree existed in all realms simultaneously, its roots drinking from wells of wisdom, while its branches sheltered gods and giants alike. The fragment of its heartwood that had become part of her carried memories of creation itself, the birth of the 9 worlds, the first words of power spoken into primordial darkness, the weight of destiny that pressed down on all things. "Welcome home, daughter of the deep bloodline," a voice whispered from somewhere beyond the fire. It might have been her grandmother, or her grandmother's grandmother, or the first witch who'd ever bargained with entities that dwelt in the spaces between thoughts. "We have been waiting." The cabin around her began to change. What had appeared to be simple wooden walls revealed their true nature, symbols carved into living wood, wards layered upon wards in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The floor beneath her feet showed its own hidden truth, a vast ritual circle inscribed with runes that glowed like captured aurora, each mark written in substances that had been old when the gods were young. This had never been just a sanctuary. It was a fortress of the old ways, a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin enough for mortal will to reshape reality itself. Outside, the raiders' voices had grown uncertain. Even through the thick walls, they could sense the change, the way the very air around the cabin had begun to thrum with potential violence. One of them called out again, but his words carried less bravado than before. Astrid smiled and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like ice breaking on a spring river. The woman who'd spent 3 years hiding from her true nature was drowning in power that demanded expression. What emerged from those depths was older, hungrier, and infinitely more dangerous. She spread her arms wide and spoke a single word in the tongue her grandmother had taught her, a language that predated human speech, that had been whispered between stars before the first dawn broke over Midgard. Every piece of glass in the cabin's windows exploded outward simultaneously. The raiders shouted in alarm as crystalline shards erupted from the window frames like a storm of frozen daggers. Snow began to fall upward around the cabin's perimeter, defying natural law as the very elements bent to her awakening will. The temperature dropped so suddenly that breath became visible clouds and exposed metal sang with cold. Through her enhanced senses, Astrid felt their fear spike. These men had come hunting what they believed was a helpless cripple. Instead, they'd found something from their ancestors' darkest stories, a daughter of the witch bloodline in her full terrible glory, backed by wolves whose eyes burned with human intelligence and fury. But there would be no mercy for their ignorance. They'd made their choice when they'd fired arrows into her sanctuary, when they'd called her witch like it was a curse instead of a warning. Now she would show them exactly what that word truly meant. The threshold was crossed. The peaceful exile named Astrid Ironwill was gone, consumed by fires that had been banked but never truly extinguished. What remained was something far older and far less forgiving. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the world itself held its breath. Then chaos erupted. The raiders came charging through the crystalline storm, their earlier confidence shattered but desperation driving them forward. Steel rang against steel as they broke from the tree line. 6 men in mismatched armor wielding weapons that gleamed with more than reflected moonlight. Astrid's enhanced vision caught details that would have been impossible moments before. Runes etched into blade edges, amulets hanging from leather cords. The subtle wrongness that clung to their movements like shadow. These weren't mere brigands. They were word-touched, marked by the same old powers she'd just embraced. The first raider reached her doorway as the upward-falling snow began to coalesce into shapes that memory insisted couldn't exist. Astrid raised her hand, fingers spread wide, and spoke another word in the star tongue. The man's sword shattered mid-swing, iron screaming as it turned to rust and fell away like autumn leaves. But instead of fleeing, he smiled, a rictus grin that revealed teeth filed to points. Finally, he rasped, his voice carrying harmonics that set her bones to aching. The last daughter shows herself. Understanding crashed over her like ice water. This hadn't been a random attack. They'd known exactly what they would find here, had come prepared for battle with something far beyond mortal ken. The crude arrows and apparent desperation had been theater, meant to draw her power into the open. Someone had sent them, someone who knew what she was. Fenris launched himself at the nearest attacker, his massive jaws seeking the throat, but the raider twisted away with inhuman speed. Moonlight caught the man's eyes, revealing pupils that reflected light like a cat's. Whatever these men had been once, they'd traded their humanity for gifts that let them match supernatural foes. "The Northern Kings send their regards," the leader called out, deflecting Scotty's strike with a blade that suddenly blazed with cold fire. "Your bloodline has been problematic for their expansion plans." The Northern Kings. Astrid's enhanced awareness reached back through inherited memories, touching knowledge passed down through generations of her grandmother's line. Christian converts who'd united the scattered clans under promises of Southern gold and Roman protection, systematically hunting down the old families who remembered what Norway had been before the new god's influence spread like plague. They'd found her at last, but they'd also made a critical error. They'd come expecting the hedge witch who'd fled Hedeby's ruins, not the inheritor of power that ran back to the world's first winter. Astrid stepped through her doorway into the storm of her own making. Snow spiraled around her like a living thing, each flake sharp as steel and twice as bright. The wooden leg that had once been her burden now anchored her to forces that predated human civilization, connecting her through Yggdrasil's consciousness to currents of word that flowed beneath all things. "You want to see problematic?" she asked, her voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "Let me show you what my bloodline can truly do." The leader's filed teeth caught moonlight as his grin widened. "We were hoping you'd say that." He raised a horn to his lips and blew a single piercing note that seemed to tear holes in the night sky. Answering calls echoed from the forest, not 6 raiders, but dozens. Torches bloomed among the trees like malevolent stars, revealing the true scope of the trap that had been laid for her. They came from every direction at once. Men and women wearing the colors of a dozen different clans, united under banners that bore Christian crosses worked in northern silver. Some rode horses whose breath steamed with unnatural cold. Others loped forward on foot with the fluid grace of those who'd learned to hunt things that fled on more than 2 legs. At their head rode a figure in armor that sang with borrowed power, plate mail inscribed with prayers in Latin, a sword that blazed with holy fire, eyes that burned with the certainty of those who'd never questioned their righteousness. A paladin in service to the new god, sent north to cleanse the land of old things. Astrid Ironwill, the armored figure called out, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. By order of King Harold and the will of Christ Almighty, you are commanded to surrender yourself for purification. Your crimes against the natural order end tonight. Astrid felt laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest. Wild, fierce sound that held echoes of her grandmother's mirth and something far less human. Around her, the upward falling snow began to take definite shapes. Warriors carved from winter itself, their faces familiar despite their crystalline features. Her sisters, all of them. Not just Gudrun and Thyra, who ran beside her as wolves, but every shield maiden who'd died at Hedeby, every woman of her bloodline who'd fallen defending the old ways. The dead remembered, and they were very, very angry. "Come then," Astrid called back, spreading her arms wide as ancestral power flowed through her like molten starlight. "Let's discuss purification." The true battle was finally beginning. The night held its breath as 2 forces faced each other across the clearing, old magic and new faith, winter's fury against holy fire. Astrid could feel the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow, the culmination of bloodlines and broken oaths that stretched back to the world's first winter. The paladin's sword pulsed with sanctified light, its radiance making her snow spirits flicker like candle flames in a strong wind. But the holy fire that blazed along its edge wasn't pure. Astrid's enhanced senses caught the underlying corruption, the twisted bargains that had been struck to forge weapons capable of harming the word touched. He'd traded pieces of his soul for the power to destroy hers, and the irony of it made her grandmother's laughter echo through inherited memory. "They always become what they claim to fight," the old woman's voice whispered from beyond death's veil. "The question is whether you'll do the same." Around the clearing's perimeter, the assembled raiders waited with predatory patience. Astrid counted at least 30, maybe more lurking in the deeper shadows. Each one bore marks of supernatural enhancement, eyes that reflected torchlight, movements too fluid for mortal joints, weapons that hummed with borrowed power. The northern kings hadn't sent mere soldiers to end her line. They'd sent hunters specifically crafted to kill things like her. Fenris pressed against her left side, his massive frame vibrating with barely contained violence. Through their bond, she felt his readiness to die protecting her, the simple wolf certainty that pack bonds transcended individual survival. But she also sensed something else, a growing awareness of what they truly faced, filtered through Gudrun's battle-hardened instincts that even death and transformation hadn't erased. This wasn't a fight they could win through conventional means. Skadi positioned herself at Astrid's right, midnight fur, bristling, as her intelligent eyes tracked the enemy formations with tactical precision. Thyra's mind still worked behind those wolf features, calculating angles and weaknesses with the same methodical approach she'd once applied to shield wall formations. 3 against 30 was impossible odds, even with supernatural abilities on their side. But Astrid wasn't planning to fight conventionally. The wooden leg thrummed with Yggdrasil's vast consciousness, connecting her to power sources that transcended the physical realm. Through that link, she felt the deep roots of the world tree drinking from wells of primordial force, its branches sheltering realities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The fragment of heartwood that had become part of her carried memories of cosmic creation and cosmic destruction. "Your gods are dying," the paladin called out, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of the truly faithful. "The old ways fade before the light of Christ. Surrender now, and your end will be clean." Astrid smiled, feeling winter's kiss upon her lips as power built behind her breastbone like a storm gathering strength. "My gods were ancient when yours was still a carpenter's son," she replied, her words carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "And they remember what it means to be hungry." She raised her arms toward the star-scattered sky and spoke 3 words in the tongue that predated human speech. The syllables fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through reality itself. The dead began to answer. Not just her fallen sisters, but every soul that had died in these woods defending the old ways. Warriors who'd fallen to Christian blades, wise women burned for refusing conversion, children who'd starved when the new faith strictures replaced time-tested traditions. They rose from snow and shadow with eyes like winter stars, their forms carved from crystallized moonlight and ancient fury. The raiders shifted nervously as ghostly figures materialized between the trees. Some of the hired killers were muttering prayers that seemed to stick in their throats, while others gripped weapons that suddenly felt inadequate against opponents who'd already died once. But the paladin's resolve never wavered. If anything, the appearance of the restless dead seemed to strengthen his conviction. "Necromancy," he declared, raising his blazing sword like a beacon. "You prove your corruption with every breath, witch. These souls cry out for release from your dark bindings." Astrid felt something crack inside her chest, not from his words, but from the realization of what she was becoming. The dead that answered her call weren't bound by love or loyalty. They came because her power compelled them, because the magic flowing through her demanded service, regardless of willing consent. Fenris whined softly, sensing her sudden uncertainty through their bond. The great wolf's simple faith in her goodness wavered as he felt the darkness threading through her intentions. Even transformed by desperate ritual, Gudrun's core nature recognized the difference between protective fury and hungry domination. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, Astrid stood balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and damnation. She could feel the weight of all the choices that had brought her to this moment, the ritual that had saved and transformed her sisters, the isolation that had preserved her sanity but solved nothing, the power that offered victory at a price she was only beginning to understand. The paladin raised his sword, holy fire reflecting off armor inscribed with prayers. Around the clearing, 30 enhanced killers prepared to charge. In the shadows between trees, the vengeful dead waited for her command. Everything balanced on what she chose to become. The choice shattered through Astrid like breaking ice. She couldn't become the monster they believed her to be. Not when Fenris looked at her with such desperate trust, not when the ghosts hovering in the shadows carried the weight of unwilling servitude. The power thrumming through her wooden leg demanded unleashing, promised victory through dominion, but that path led only to becoming what the paladin claimed she already was. "Go," she whispered to the restless dead, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I release you." The spectral warriors flickered like dying flames, confusion rippling through their ethereal forms. Some turned toward her with expressions of gratitude before dissolving into starlight, while others lingered as if uncertain they'd heard correctly. She'd called them to service and now cast them aside, a mercy their surprised faces suggested they'd never expected from one who wielded such power. The paladin's eyes narrowed as the ghostly army began to fade. "Tricks and illusions," he declared, though uncertainty colored his voice. "You seek to lull us into complacency before—" Astrid stepped forward, cutting off his words. "No tricks, no illusions." Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo through her own, carrying the weight of generations who'd stood against impossible odds. Just a woman defending her home. The raiders exchanged glances, some looking relieved while others appeared disappointed. They'd come prepared for supernatural warfare, armed with blessed weapons and protective charms. A straightforward fight seemed almost anticlimactic after the display of power they'd witnessed. But they'd underestimated what 3 years of isolation had taught her. Astrid placed her palm against the nearest pine tree, feeling the slow pulse of its ancient heartbeat. Through Yggdrasil's connection, she touched the consciousness of every tree in the surrounding forest, not to command or compel, but to ask for aid. The request rippled through root networks that stretched for miles, carrying her plea to stands of oak and ash that remembered when Norway belonged to older powers. The forest answered willingly. Branches began to creak and groan as massive trunks shifted position with glacial deliberation. Roots erupted from snow-covered earth to form barriers and tripwires where none had existed moments before. The terrain itself began reshaping around the raiders, not through supernatural compulsion, but because the trees chose to help one who asked rather than demanded. The first attacker stumbled as the ground beneath his feet buckled, sending him sprawling into a snowdrift that hadn't been there seconds earlier. Another found his retreat blocked by a low-hanging branch that scraped across his shoulders with deliberate intent. The forest was taking sides, and it remembered who belonged here. "Fenris, Skadi, hunt," Astrid commanded, her voice carrying the authority of pack leadership rather than magical coercion. The wolves needed no supernatural enhancement to be deadly. Gudrun and Thyra's human intelligence combined with lupine instincts created predators that could outthink as well as outfight their prey. The great wolves split apart with coordinated precision, vanishing into the transformed landscape like shadows given teeth. Within moments, screams echoed from the forest's edge, as raiders discovered that their enhanced abilities meant little against opponents who fought with both animal cunning and tactical expertise. The paladin spurred his horse forward, holy fire blazing brighter as he raised his sword. "Face me, witch. No hiding behind beasts and brambles." Astrid smiled grimly and drew the sacks from her belt, plain steel without blessing or enhancement, sharp enough to gut a deer and nothing more. The wooden leg beneath her thrummed with potential power, Yggdrasil's consciousness offering strength that could shatter mountains and freeze seas solid. She ignored every whispered promise of easy victory. "As you wish," she replied, stepping into the clearing's center. The paladin's blade came down in an arc of sanctified flame that should have cleaved her in two. Instead, Astrid pivoted on her wooden leg with perfect balance, the prosthetic's supernatural connection to the world tree granting her stability that no amount of blessed steel could shake. Her sacks scraped along his armor's edge, finding the gap between breastplate and pauldron where human sweat had weakened the protective prayers. Blood welled, startlingly red against silver mail. The paladin's eyes widened in shock. His blessed armor should have turned any mundane blade, yet somehow her simple knife had found purchase. What he couldn't understand was that Yggdrasil's heartwood didn't grant her supernatural sharpness. It provided perfect awareness of how forces move through the world, showing her exactly where pressure applied at the right angle could overcome any defense. "Impossible," he breathed, spurring his mount backward. "No," Astrid replied, advancing with the measured pace of someone who knew the forest would reshape itself to aid her steps. Just very, very old knowledge applied by someone who finally understands what she's fighting for. Around them, the night filled with sounds of desperate battle as enhanced raiders discovered that supernatural abilities were poor substitutes for fighting on ground that actively opposed them. The true ordeal wasn't about power. It was about choosing to remain human while using gifts that could easily consume her humanity. She'd made her choice. Now came the test of surviving it. The paladin's counterattack came with the fury of absolute conviction. His blessed blade carved through the air where Astrid had been standing, trailing holy fire that seared the snow into steam. But the ground beneath her wooden leg shifted subtly, Yggdrasil's awareness guiding her steps away from the killing stroke by mere inches. She felt the heat of sanctified flames across her cheek as she rolled beneath his horse's hooves, coming up with sacks extended toward the mount's unprotected belly. The blade met blessed horseshoes that sparked with protective runes, jarring her arm to the shoulder. "Your heathen tricks won't save you," the paladin snarled, wielding his destrier with practiced skill. "I am the sword arm of Christ, and his light burns away all darkness." Around the clearing, the sounds of battle were shifting. Too many screams belonged to familiar voices. Fenris's challenging howl cut short by the clang of steel, Skadi's snarling interrupted by human laughter. The enhanced raiders had adapted faster than expected, their supernatural gifts allowing them to match her wolves' speed and strength. Through her bond with the great wolves, Astrid felt their pain like knives in her chest. Fenris was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, his lupine fury no match for opponents who fought with borrowed divine power. Scotty limped on 3 legs, silver-blessed iron having found its mark despite Thyra's tactical brilliance. The forest's aid was faltering too. Blessed axes bit deep into helpful branches, while prayers spoken in Latin seemed to wither the tree's willingness to assist. The raiders had come prepared for exactly this kind of warfare, carrying tools specifically designed to counter the old ways. "You hear that?" The paladin's voice carried terrible satisfaction. "Your guardians fall to righteous steel. Your forest burns before holy fire. Surrender now, and their suffering ends quickly." Astrid's grip tightened on her sacks as desperation clawed at her throat. Every instinct screamed for her to reach deeper into Yggdrasil's power, to tap the wellsprings of cosmic force that could turn this entire mountainside into a frozen wasteland. The temptation whispered that survival justified any cost, that protecting what she loved was worth becoming what she feared. But the memory of Gudrun's trusting eyes held her back, even as those same eyes now burned with lupine pain from across the clearing. The paladin raised his sword for what would clearly be the killing blow. Behind him, 3 more mounted warriors emerged from the tree line, their armor gleaming with protective blessings. Any hope of fighting her way clear died as Astrid counted the odds. 6 armed riders in blessed gear, while her strongest allies bled out in the snow. That was when the horn sounded. Not the crude bronze instrument the raiders had used to call their ambush, but something far older, a sound like winter wind through mountain peaks, carrying harmonies that seemed to emanate from the bones of the earth itself. The note hung in the frigid air long after any mortal lungs should have emptied, building rather than fading. The paladin's horse reared in sudden terror, eyes rolling white as it fought its rider's control. Around the clearing, enhanced raiders stumbled as the sound seemed to reach into their chests and squeeze. Even Astrid felt the weight of it, though Yggdrasil's connection filtered the worst effects through her wooden leg. From the darkest shadows between the trees stepped figures that made the night seem bright by comparison. Tall beyond human proportion, wrapped in furs that might have been shadow-given form, they moved with the fluid grace of winter storms made flesh. Their faces were hidden beneath antlered helms carved from what looked like crystallized starlight, and the weapons in their gauntleted hands sang with edges that cut reality itself. The Wild Hunt, the Einherjar, the dead heroes of Valhalla riding out on the longest night of winter to claim souls worthy of their attention. But they weren't here for Astrid. The lead figure, taller than the rest, bearing a spear that seemed to pierce through multiple dimensions simultaneously, turned eyeless sockets toward the mounted paladin. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of cosmic authority that made mortal claims of divine mandate sound like children playing at war. "You trespass on the sacred grove of Yggdrasil's daughter," the figure intoned. "Your presence offends the natural order." The paladin's blessed armor suddenly seemed fragile as paper in the face of power that predated his god by countless millennia. His sword's holy fire guttered like a candle in a hurricane. "I serve the one true God," he managed, though his voice cracked on the words. "My authority comes from—" "Your authority," the figure interrupted, "ends where elder laws begin." The spear moved faster than thought. The paladin's blessed armor, proof against mundane weapons and supernatural abilities alike, parted like morning mist before a blade forged in the cosmic forge of creation itself. He toppled from his saddle without even a scream, his body crumbling to ash before it struck the snow. Astrid stared in horrified fascination as the Wild Hunt turned toward the remaining raiders with expressions of cosmic hunger. She'd won, but at a cost she was only beginning to understand. The Wild Hunt's attention shifted from the crumbling ash that had been the paladin to the surviving raiders, who stood frozen in terror that transcended mortal comprehension. But as Astrid watched the cosmic predators advance with inexorable purpose, a terrible understanding began to crystallize in her mind. This wasn't salvation. This was recruitment. The lead figure, whose spear still hummed with dimensional energy, turned those hollow sockets toward her. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that bypassed her ears entirely, resonating through the Yggdrasil heartwood in her leg with meanings that made her soul shiver. "Well met, daughter of the old blood. Your restraint has been noted." Around the clearing, the other members of the hunt moved with predatory grace, herding the remaining raiders like wolves driving deer. But their movements held a ritualistic quality that spoke of ceremony rather than simple slaughter. They weren't just eliminating threats, they were harvesting something. Through her bond with Fenris and Skadi, Astrid felt her wolves' primitive terror at beings that existed beyond the natural order. Even transformed by desperate magic, Gudrun and Thyra's souls recognized entities that stood outside the cycle of life and death entirely. The great wolves backed toward her on trembling legs, seeking comfort from the only anchor they had to mortal existence. "You came for them," Astrid realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "The raiders. You came for their souls." The figure's antlered helm tilted in acknowledgement. They carry the scent of spilled innocent blood. Their enhanced abilities were purchased with the lives of those too weak to defend themselves. His attention shifted to the cowering mercenaries. Such debts require collection. One of the raiders broke and ran, his supernatural speed carrying him toward the tree line faster than any mortal eye could follow. He made it perhaps 20 yards before another hunt member materialized directly in his path, moving through space like smoke given form. The spear thrust was almost casual, yet reality seemed to fold around the point of impact. The raider simply stopped existing, not death, erasure. "But you," the lead figure continued, turning back to Astrid, "chose differently when power was offered. You released the bound dead rather than compelling their service. You fought with mortal weapons rather than embracing cosmic force. Something that might have been approval colored his inhuman voice. Such choices have consequences." The wooden leg beneath her thrummed with sudden resonance, Yggdrasil's consciousness awakening to possibilities she'd never imagined. Through that connection, Astrid felt the vast network of the World Tree's awareness, not just spanning her forest, but reaching across all 9 realms of existence. Every branch, every root, every leaf connected to a web of knowledge that encompassed the fundamental structure of reality itself. And she was part of it, had always been part of it, from the moment her grandmother carved the prosthetic from heartwood and bound it to her shattered leg with blood and sacrifice. "The old compact is remembered," the figure intoned. "When the last of the witch clans proved their worth through wisdom rather than dominion, the agreement was sealed. Your bloodline serves as guardian and interpreter, standing between the cosmic forces and the mortal realm." Memory flooded through her, not her own memories, but those carried in Yggdrasil's rings of growth. Images of her grandmother as a young woman, standing in this same clearing while accepting a responsibility that would echo through generations. The weight of maintaining balance between powers that could reshape existence and humans too fragile to survive direct contact with such forces. "That's why you never taught me," Astrid breathed, understanding finally clicking into place. Grandmother knew this day would come. Knew I'd have to choose between power and humanity without knowing the full consequences. The test had never been about surviving the raiders. It had been about proving she could touch cosmic force without being consumed by it, that she could wield Yggdrasil's power while remaining fundamentally human at her core. Around them, the wild hunt finished their grim harvest. The enhanced raiders simply vanished one by one, their stolen abilities and blood-bought augmentations providing no defense against entities that existed beyond mortal concepts of strength. Only ash and empty armor remained where 30 killers had stood moments before. "Your exile ends," the figure declared, his spear finally dimming as the hunt's purpose was fulfilled. "The world changes, daughter. New faiths rise while old powers wake from slumber. The balance requires active tending now, not through dominion, but through understanding." Astrid felt Fenris and Skadi press against her legs, their wolf forms trembling with residual fear, but offering what comfort they could. Through their bond, she sensed Gudrun and Thyra's relief that the cosmic terror was ending, but also their certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The wild hunt began to fade like morning mist, their purpose complete. But the lead figure's final words hung in the crystalline air like a promise and a burden combined. "Welcome to your true inheritance, Astrid Ironwill. The real ordeal begins now." The silence that followed the wild hunt's departure felt heavier than winter itself. Astrid stood in the center of the clearing, her breath forming crystalline clouds in air that still crackled with residual cosmic energy. Where 30 raiders had stood moments before, only scattered ash and empty armor remained, already disappearing beneath fresh snowfall that seemed eager to erase all evidence of the night's violence. Her wooden leg thrummed with fading power, Yggdrasil's consciousness settling back into dormancy like a great beast returning to slumber. But something fundamental had changed in that connection. The prosthetic no longer felt like carved wood grafted to her flesh. It felt like a living part of her, roots extending not just into bone and muscle, but into the very fabric of reality itself. Fenris and Skadi pressed closer against her legs, their massive forms still trembling from exposure to entities that existed beyond the natural order. Through their shared bond, Astrid felt Gudrun and Thyra's human consciousness struggling to process what they'd witnessed. The wild hunt had shown them glimpses of cosmic forces so vast that mortal minds could barely comprehend their edges. "It's over," Astrid whispered. Though she knew the words were more hope than certainty, her hands moved automatically to examine the wolves' injuries. Shallow cuts from blessed steel, burns from holy fire, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and care. Their supernatural vitality was already beginning to knit torn flesh and mend cracked bone. She limped toward the tree line where her cabin waited, each step revealing the true extent of the battle's devastation. Ancient pines bore scorch marks from sanctified flames. Deep gouges in the earth showed where blessed weapons had carved protective circles. The forest that had answered her call now wore scars that would take decades to fully heal. But as she moved through the damaged landscape, Astrid began to notice something else. The trees weren't simply wounded, they were different. The bark bore new patterns, spiral growths that matched the carvings on her wooden leg. The root networks beneath the snow pulsed with faint luminescence, as if Yggdrasil's awakening had left permanent traces throughout the entire grove. Her cabin stood undamaged, its humble walls somehow having remained untouched by cosmic forces that could erase men from existence. The familiar sight should have brought comfort, but instead, Astrid felt a strange sense of displacement. How could she return to simple hermit life after touching the fundamental structure of reality itself? Inside, she built up the fire and tended to her wolves with the same methodical care she'd learned during 3 years of isolation. But her hands moved with new certainty, guided by knowledge she didn't remember acquiring. When she cleaned their wounds, she knew instinctively which herbs would accelerate healing. When she bound their injuries, her fingers wove patterns that seemed to strengthen the bandages beyond their physical properties. The wild hunt's leader had spoken of her true inheritance, and Astrid was beginning to understand what that meant. The witch blood in her veins wasn't just about casting spells or communing with spirits, it carried the accumulated wisdom of generations who had served as intermediaries between cosmic forces and fragile mortal existence. Every woman in her bloodline had faced this same awakening, this same choice between power and humanity. She settled beside the fire with Fenris and Skadi flanking her, their warmth a comforting anchor to physical reality. Through their bond, she felt Gudrun and Thyra's personalities reasserting themselves as the shock of cosmic exposure faded. Her shield sisters had questions about what they'd witnessed, about what came next, about whether their shared existence could survive the changes ahead. "The exile ends," Astrid murmured, repeating the hunt leader's words. But exile from what? And to what purpose? The wooden leg pulsed once, and suddenly she could feel them. Other nodes in Yggdrasil's vast network. Scattered across the northern realms, hidden in remote groves and forgotten ruins, were others like her. Guardians who had awakened to their heritage, protectors standing watch over places where cosmic forces touched the mortal world. Some were stronger, their abilities honed by years of active service. Others were newer, struggling with powers they barely understood. All of them were connected through the world tree's consciousness, and all of them faced the same fundamental challenge: maintaining the balance between forces that could reshape existence and civilizations too young to survive direct contact with such power. The fire crackled, sending sparks up through the smoke hole toward stars that seemed closer than before. Astrid could feel winter's grip beginning to loosen, not the seasonal change she'd expected, but something deeper. The cosmic disturbance had altered the natural rhythms, accelerating cycles that should have taken months to complete. Spring would come early to the Whispering Pines, bringing with it travelers who would seek answers she was only beginning to understand. Her time as a hermit was ending, whether she wished it or not. The real ordeal, learning to wield cosmic responsibility without losing her essential humanity, was just beginning. As dawn approached with unnatural swiftness, Astrid felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a funeral shroud. The accelerated season brought sounds she'd learned to dread during 3 years of deliberate isolation, the distant voices of travelers on winter paths that should have remained impassable for months yet. The cosmic disturbance had indeed altered everything, drawing seekers and wanderers to her grove like iron filings to lodestone. She stood at her cabin's threshold, watching Fenris and Skadi test their healing wounds with careful movements. Through their bond, she felt Gudrun and Thyra's growing restlessness, her shield sisters' souls chafing against the constraints of wolf flesh now that they'd glimpsed forces vast enough to restore their human forms. The binding magic that held them was unraveling, thread by careful thread, as Yggdrasil's awakening offered new possibilities she couldn't ignore. The first group arrived at midday. A dozen desperate villagers from settlements beyond the Whispering Pines, their faces haggard with the particular exhaustion that came from witnessing the impossible. They spoke of crops growing overnight in frozen fields, of livestock giving birth to creatures that belonged in fever dreams, of children speaking prophecies in languages that predated human civilization. The wise woman of Birka said you might have answers, their spokesman pleaded, his weathered hands clasped before him like a supplicant. She said the old blood ran true in these woods, that someone here might know how to stop the madness. Astrid's wooden leg pulsed with recognition. The wise woman of Birka, another node in the network, another guardian awakening to her purpose. The connections were strengthening across the northern realms, drawing those with heritage and responsibility into a web of shared burden. "I have no easy answers," she replied. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. Knowledge flowed through Yggdrasil's network like sap through living wood, carrying insights from guardians who had faced similar crises in ages past. She could sense their experiences, their hard-won wisdom, their warnings about the cost of intervention. The villagers departed with herbs and protective charms she found herself weaving without conscious thought, her fingers moving in patterns taught by ancestral memory. But they would return, they and others like them, drawn by need and guided by forces beyond their understanding. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, more visitors found their way to her clearing. A young skald seeking songs that could calm reality's fluctuations, a ship captain whose vessel had sailed through a storm and emerged in waters that shouldn't exist, a mother carrying a child whose dreams were reshaping the world around him in increasingly dangerous ways. Each encounter forced Astrid further from the hermit's path she'd clung to so desperately. Each act of guidance, each moment of teaching, each thread of power shared committed her more deeply to a role she'd never chosen but could no longer deny. That evening, as she tended her fire and contemplated the impossible transformation of her existence, Fenris approached with deliberate purpose. The great wolf's eyes held Gudrun's unmistakable intelligence, and when he spoke, not through lupine sounds but directly into her mind through their bond, his words carried the weight of a decision 3 years in the making. "Sister," Gudrun's voice echoed in her thoughts, clear and determined. "We've hidden long enough. Thyra and I both feel it. The bindings weaken as your power grows. We could return to human form, stand beside you as we did in life, help you bear this burden as proper shield sisters should." The temptation was overwhelming, To have her closest companions restored, to face the cosmic responsibility ahead with allies who understood both her strengths and her fears, it would be so easy to reach into Yggdrasil's awakening consciousness and reshape the magic that bound their souls. But the memory of that first desperate night stopped her cold. She'd performed the binding ritual in grief and rage, compelling their spirits to return when they should have found rest in whatever afterlife awaited fallen warriors. The magic had been born from her need, not their choice, a violation disguised as love. "If I free you to choose," Astrid whispered into the fire's dancing flames, "will you stay?" The silence that followed spoke volumes. Through the wolf bond, she felt her shield sister's conflict, love for her warring against the natural desire for rest, duty battling against the peace that death should have brought them. "We don't know," Thyra's voice finally answered. "Honest as always. That's why it has to be our choice to make." Astrid closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of what true guardianship meant. Not just protecting others from cosmic forces too vast for mortal comprehension, but protecting those she loved from her own desperate need for their presence. The final confrontation wouldn't be with raiders or cosmic entities. It would be with her own willingness to let go. Tomorrow, she would begin unweaving the magic that had sustained her through 3 years of exile, regardless of the consequences. The road back to humanity led through the hardest choice of all. Dawn arrived with the weight of finality, and Astrid knew there could be no more delay. She had spent the night in meditation, her consciousness flowing through Yggdrasil's network, drawing upon the accumulated wisdom of every guardian who had faced this same crossroads. Each whispered voice from the past carried the same message: true power lay not in binding others to your will, but in having the strength to set them free. The ritual site was ready. She had cleared a circle in the grove where cosmic energies ran strongest, where the boundary between realms remained thin from the wild hunt's passage. Ancient symbols carved themselves into the frozen earth at her touch, guided by ancestral memory that reached back to the first compact between her bloodline and the cosmic forces. The patterns pulsed with faint luminescence, responding to the power flowing through her wooden leg. Fenris and Skadi sat at the circle's edge, their massive forms alert but trusting. Through their bond, Astrid felt Gudrun and Thyra's complex mixture of anticipation and terror. For 3 years, they had existed in borrowed flesh, their human consciousness compressed into wolf minds. The prospect of choosing their fate freely was both liberation and judgment. "Are you certain of this path?" Gudrun's voice whispered through the connection. "You've grown strong enough to reshape the binding completely. We could serve as true partners, not bound spirits but willing allies." The temptation burned through Astrid like winter fire. With Yggdrasil's power flowing through her, she could craft bonds based on love rather than compulsion, create a partnership that honored both duty and desire. Her shield sisters could return as themselves, not enslaved souls, but willing guardians who chose to stand beside her. But that choice would still be made under duress, influenced by gratitude for restoration and shaped by their affection for her. How could any decision be truly free when made by spirits she had already wronged? "The magic was born from my grief," Astrid said aloud, her words carrying across the clearing like an oath. "It has to die from my acceptance." She placed her hands on the earth and opened herself completely to Yggdrasil's consciousness. Power flowed through her wooden leg, not the controlled trickle she'd learned to manage, but a torrent that threatened to sweep away everything she recognized as human. The world tree's awareness was vast beyond mortal comprehension, a network spanning 9 realms touching every corner of existence, carrying the accumulated experience of eons. Within that cosmic perspective, 3 human lives were less than whispers. The binding magic she had woven appeared as fragile threads, easily dissolved with a thought. But the threads were interwoven with her own essence, her love and need and desperate refusal to accept loss. Unmaking the spell meant unmaking part of herself. The first thread snapped, and Fenris convulsed as if struck. Through their fragmenting bond, Astrid felt Gudrun's consciousness flutter between wolf instinct and human memory. The great wolf's eyes rolled back, showing white, while otherworldly light began to seep from his wounds like luminous blood. "Sister," Gudrun's voice came weaker now, distorted by the dissolution of their connection. "Don't grieve for us again. We chose to answer your call because we loved you. That choice was real, even if the magic was flawed." Another thread parted, and Skadi began to glow from within, her fur becoming translucent as the soul beneath prepared for release. Thyra's presence felt increasingly distant, her consciousness already turning toward whatever lay beyond the veil of mortal existence. Astrid wept as she continued the unweaving, each severed connection tearing away a piece of her own heart. The cosmic power flowing through her could have easily repaired the damage, could have transformed grief into acceptance with supernatural ease. But she forced herself to feel every cut, every loss, every moment of human pain that made her who she truly was. The final threads dissolved like smoke in starlight. Fenris and Skadi collapsed as their borrowed life force fled, their massive forms shrinking back to normal wolf proportions. Not the supernatural guardians bound by magic, but simple animals who had been touched by forces beyond their understanding. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, two familiar figures stood in the circle beside their fallen wolf forms. Gudrun and Thyra appeared as Astrid remembered them, young and strong and laughing, their weapons bright in spectral hands. They looked upon her with expressions of infinite compassion and terrible understanding. "You've learned the hardest lesson," Thyra said, her voice echoing from beyond death itself. "Power over others is just another kind of cage. But you've broken yours, sister. You're finally free." They faded like morning mist, taking with them the last traces of Astrid's desperate magic. Where they had stood, only peace remained, the deep silence of debts repaid and burdens lifted. Astrid knelt beside the unconscious wolves, her tears falling on fur that breathed with natural rhythm. They would live, but as themselves rather than vessels for human souls. Her guardians were gone, her power remained, and her true test as protector of the balance had finally begun. The cosmic forces still flowed through Yggdrasil's network, still demanded her service as guardian and interpreter, but now she would face that responsibility as herself alone, flawed, grieving, and utterly human. The wolves stirred at dawn, and with them came the true test of Astrid's choice. Fenris opened golden eyes that held no trace of Gudrun's fierce intelligence, only the simple awareness of an animal awakening to hunger and the scent of approaching strangers. Skadi raised her head with lupine curiosity, rather than Thyra's tactical assessment, ears swiveling toward sounds that meant nothing more than potential threat or prey. They were beautiful in their ordinary wildness, but Astrid felt their loss like a physical wound. 3 years of shared consciousness had ended, leaving her truly alone for the first time since that desperate night when grief had driven her to impossible magic. The approaching footsteps belonged to no desperate villagers seeking wisdom. These moved with predatory purpose through the grove, their rhythm speaking of violence barely held in check. Astrid's wooden leg pulsed with warning as hostile intent registered through Yggdrasil's network, men whose hearts carried the particular darkness of those who had chosen to profit from chaos. She counted at least 8, their voices carrying across the morning air with the casual cruelty of wolves discussing prey. "Told you the hermit woman was just another fraud. Look at this place, nothing but tricks and forest magic. The real power's in that wooden leg, carved from the world tree itself. Sell that to the right buyer, we could—" Astrid's blood turned to ice. These weren't random raiders or desperate survivors of cosmic upheaval. They knew what she was, knew the source of her abilities. Someone had sent them specifically to claim her prosthetic and the power it contained. The first man emerged from the tree line with drawn sword, his face bearing the ritual scars of a berserker cult. Behind him came 7 others, warriors whose weapons gleamed with the telltale shimmer of blessed steel, sanctified specifically to disrupt supernatural defenses. They had planned this assault with the same methodical precision once used against her kind in the ancient purges. "Astrid Ironwill," the leader called, his voice carrying mock courtesy over barely contained violence. "Daughter of the old blood, guardian of powers that belong to stronger hands, we've come to relieve you of burdens too great for a crippled woman to bear." Fenris and Skadi flanked her with natural loyalty, their hackles raised and teeth bared, but they were only wolves now, brave and fierce, but possessing no supernatural strength to match blessed weapons and trained killers. Against 8 berserkers, they would die within moments of any fight beginning. Astrid felt the cosmic forces flowing through Yggdrasil's network, power enough to turn these men into ash, or transform them into something harmless. The World Tree's consciousness offered a dozen ways to end the threat without meaningful effort. Reality could be reshaped, time could be altered, the very concepts of violence and cruelty could be temporarily excised from their minds. But each solution carried a price that went beyond mere magical exhaustion. The guardians who had come before whispered warnings through ancestral memory. Power used too casually became easier to justify, easier to rationalize, until the protector became the very force that needed containing. How many cosmic horrors had begun as well-intentioned interventions? "You mistake me for someone who fears death," Astrid replied, rising to her feet with deliberate calm. "I've already lost everything that mattered. What you see as weakness, I call freedom." The berserker leader laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Freedom? You're bound to that tree leg like a dog to its chain. Every pulse of power makes you less human, more monster. We're offering mercy, a clean death instead of slow transformation into something the world would need to hunt down." His words struck closer to her deepest fears than any blade could manage. The cosmic awareness flowing through her prosthetic did carry that risk. Each use of Yggdrasil's power made purely human concern seem smaller, more trivial. She could feel herself changing with every passing hour, growing more distant from the mortality she fought to preserve. But that was exactly why this confrontation mattered. Not because these 8 men posed any real threat to someone connected to the World Tree's infinite power, but because her response would define what kind of guardian she chose to become. The berserkers advanced in practiced formation, their blessed weapons raised to strike. Fenris and Skadi tensed to spring, their loyalty absolute even without supernatural enhancement. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, cosmic forces awaiting her command, ordinary courage preparing to face impossible odds, and her own humanity hanging in the balance. Astrid planted her feet and drew the simple iron sax from her belt, its unadorned blade reflecting morning light with honest steel rather than mystical radiance. If she was to remain human while wielding cosmic responsibility, it would begin with fighting like one. The confrontation that would truly test her worthiness as guardian was finally at hand. The first berserker's blessed blade swept toward Astrid's throat with practiced precision, but 3 years of exile hadn't dulled her warrior instincts. She ducked under the strike and drove her sax upward, finding the gap beneath his ritual scars. Hot blood sprayed across frost-covered ground as he fell. 7 remained, and they came at her with renewed fury. Fenris leaped at the nearest attacker's throat, while Skadi hamstrung another, but these were ordinary wolves facing blessed steel. A sanctified blade opened a gash across Fenris's flank, sending him sprawling with a yelp of pain. Skadi's courage earned her a pommel strike that dropped her unconscious to the earth. "Kill them!" snarled one of the berserkers, raising his sword to finish the wounded wolf. The sight of Fenris bleeding, not Gudrun's supernatural guardian but a simple animal who had chosen loyalty, shattered Astrid's resolve to fight purely human. Power erupted from her wooden leg as she reached desperately into Yggdrasil's network, cosmic forces flowing through her with the fury of colliding worlds. The berserker's sword turned to ash in his hands. The ground beneath another's feet opened like a hungry mouth, swallowing him whole before sealing seamlessly. A third screamed as his blessed armor became molten metal, cooking him alive within steel meant to protect. But with each use of cosmic power, Astrid felt pieces of her humanity burning away like kindling in an inferno. The World Tree's consciousness was vast beyond mortal comprehension, and touching it directly threatened to dissolve everything that made her herself into that infinite awareness. She could feel her memories growing distant, her human concerns becoming trivial abstractions beneath the weight of cosmic responsibility. The remaining berserkers pressed their attack with desperate ferocity, recognizing their only chance lay in forcing her to exhaust the supernatural abilities. Their blessed weapons disrupted her more subtle magics, requiring increasingly dramatic displays of power to overcome their protections. Reality twisted around her as she fought to protect the wolves while maintaining some thread of human identity. Trees became tentacles that crushed attackers before reverting to ordinary wood. Gravity reversed itself to dash men against the canopy, their bones snapping like dry twigs. The very concept of sharpness fled from their weapons, leaving them holding blunt metal clubs. With each impossible intervention, Astrid felt herself changing in ways that went beyond mere exhaustion. Her thoughts began operating on cosmic timescales where individual lives were fleeting sparks. The distinction between protecting life and reshaping reality according to her will grew increasingly meaningless. Only 2 berserkers remained, but they had achieved their true objective. The woman facing them was no longer quite human, her eyes reflecting depths that belonged among stars rather than mortal flesh. She had become the very thing their order existed to contain, a guardian so drunk on cosmic power that she had forgotten what it meant to be merely mortal. "You see?" the leader gasped, his own death approaching but his purpose fulfilled. "This is why the old blood cannot be trusted. Give you enough threat, enough provocation, and you become the monster anyway." His words pierced through the cosmic haze clouding her thoughts. Astrid looked down at her hands, seeing them wreathed in energies that could unmake mountains. Around her, the grove had become an alien landscape of twisted physics and impossible geometry. The wolves lay unconscious but breathing, protected by forces that bent causality itself around their fragile forms. She was winning the battle while losing everything that mattered about the victory. The choice crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. She could complete the transformation, become something beyond human limitation, and spend eternity as guardian of cosmic balance. The power was hers. Yggdrasil's network stretched across 9 realms waiting for her command. She could protect everyone, prevent all suffering, reshape existence itself according to her understanding of justice and mercy. Or she could choose to remain human, with all the weakness and limitation that entailed. Except that some battles couldn't be won without losing what made winning worthwhile. Astrid looked at Fenris struggling to rise despite his wounds, at Skadi's unconscious form curled protectively near the den they had shared. These simple creatures had chosen to stand with her not because of cosmic destiny or supernatural compulsion, but from the basic loyalty that made life meaningful. She closed her eyes and severed her connection to Yggdrasil's network. The cosmic forces fled like water through broken fingers, leaving behind only a woman with a wooden leg and a simple iron blade. The berserkers' blessed weapons found their sharpness again. Reality reasserted its familiar rules. The impossible became mundane, leaving her facing 2 trained killers with nothing but mortal skill and failing strength. But as the berserkers raised their swords for the final strike, Astrid smiled. She had chosen her humanity over power, her mortality over dominion. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself. The blades descended toward her heart. The blades stopped mere inches from Astrid's chest. Not through any last-moment surge of supernatural power, but because Fenris had found strength enough to lunge between them. The wounded wolf's teeth closed around the lead berserker's wrist with desperate ferocity, while Skadi, conscious again despite her injuries, hamstrung the second man from behind. Both warriors toppled, their blessed weapons clattering uselessly against frozen ground. The leader tried to shake off Fenris's grip, but the wolf held fast even as blood matted his golden fur. His eyes met Astrid's for a heartbeat that contained entire conversations. Simple animal loyalty choosing to protect what it loved, asking nothing more than the chance to stand beside her. "Call off your beast," the berserker gasped, his face pale with pain and shock. "This changes nothing. Others will come. The old blood always burns itself out in the end." Astrid knelt and gently coaxed Fenris to release his grip. The wolf limped back to her side, flanks heaving but alert for any renewed threat. Skadi positioned herself protectively near her fallen packmate, hackles still raised despite the exhaustion radiating from her small frame. "You're right," Astrid said quietly, pressing her palm against the earth to steady herself. Others will come. They always have. But today, this moment, we chose differently. She could still feel Yggdrasil's network humming distantly through her wooden leg, cosmic forces waiting beyond easy reach. The power remained available, would always remain available, but it no longer called to her with the same seductive promise of simple solutions. The choice to remain human wasn't made once. It was made again and again, moment by moment, whenever the easy path revealed itself. The berserker leader struggled to his feet, cradling his mangled wrist against his chest. Blood loss and shock had drained the predatory confidence from his features, leaving behind something almost resembling recognition. You could have unmade us entirely, turned us to dust or worse. Why didn't you? Because that's not protection, Astrid replied, helping Fenris settle more comfortably against her leg. That's just another kind of violence wearing righteousness as a mask. The surviving berserkers gathered their dead and departed without further words, their blessed weapons suddenly seeming more burden than advantage. They would report her strength, her restraint, and perhaps most importantly, her willingness to bleed rather than lose herself to the power she carried. When their footsteps faded beyond hearing, Astrid finally allowed herself to collapse beside the wolves. Her wooden leg throbbed with phantom pain that had nothing to do with the carved oak and everything to do with the connections she had severed. Not just the cosmic network, but the desperate magic that had bound her shield sisters' souls to animal forms. "They're really gone," she whispered, running her fingers through Fenris's fur. The wolf pressed against her touch with simple animal comfort, offering warmth without the complex weight of human consciousness. Gudrun, Thyra, they're finally at rest. The grief felt different now. Still present, still sharp enough to cut, but no longer infected with the desperate denial that had driven her to impossible magic 3 years ago. Her shield sisters were dead, had been dead since that terrible day at Hedeby. The wolves beside her were just wolves, brave and loyal and utterly themselves, but not vessels for human souls that belonged beyond the veil. She had lost her supernatural guardians and gained something infinitely more precious, the knowledge that love didn't require possession, that protection didn't demand control, that strength could choose restraint without becoming weakness. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the frost that had gathered during the night's confrontation. Astrid cleaned and dressed Fenris's wounds while Skadi kept watch, the three of them settling into rhythms that felt both familiar and entirely new. Without the underlying current of magical compulsion, every interaction became a genuine choice, wolf choosing to trust human, human choosing to care for wolf. As she worked, Astrid felt the cosmic awareness flowing through Yggdrasil's network, not the overwhelming torrent that threatened to wash away her humanity, but a steady current of information about distant threats and growing imbalances. Her responsibilities as guardian hadn't ended with her choice to remain mortal. If anything, they had become more complex, requiring wisdom rather than raw power. She would need to leave the grove eventually, not as a hermit fleeing human contact, but as a protector learning to navigate the space between cosmic duty and mortal limitation. The berserker's attack had proven that isolation was no longer sustainable. Others knew of her nature, her power, her purpose. Some would come as enemies, others as suppliants, but all would need to see that guardianship could exist without dominion. But that was a challenge for tomorrow. Today, there was sunlight and simple companionship, and the profound relief of choosing correctly when everything had hung in the balance. Astrid settled back against the ancient oak that had sheltered her exile. 2 wolves pressed warm against her sides and allowed herself to rest in the peace that came from remaining herself. The return. 3 weeks passed before Astrid finally gathered the courage to leave the grove that had sheltered her transformation. The journey to her old cabin through the whispering pines felt like walking through a half-remembered dream, every familiar landmark carrying the weight of who she had been when she last walked this path. The cabin stood exactly as she had left it. Rough-hewn logs weathered gray by countless storms, smoke hole dark and cold, the small clearing where she had chopped wood through 3 winters of self-imposed exile. But standing at its threshold, Astrid felt like a stranger returning to someone else's life. Fenris and Scotty explored the space with curious noses, their movements careful around wounds still healing from the berserker attack. They had no memories of this place as supernatural guardians, no connection to the desperate magic that had once bound human souls within animal forms. To them, it was simply another den, interesting for its unfamiliar sense, but no more significant than any other shelter. Astrid pushed open the cabin door with her simple walking stick, carved from ordinary ash rather than mystical oak. The hinges creaked in greeting, revealing the Spartan interior where a hermit had tried to hide from cosmic responsibility. Her old sleeping furs lay moldering in the corner. The fire pit held nothing but cold ashes. Dust motes danced through afternoon light that seemed somehow brighter than she remembered. "I was so afraid," she whispered to the empty room, her voice carrying an honesty that 3 years of isolation had never quite achieved. Afraid of becoming something monstrous, afraid of losing myself to power I never asked for. I thought hiding here would keep me human. The wolves settled near the cold hearth, watching her with patient amber eyes. They couldn't understand her words, but they sensed the significance of this moment, their pack leader confronting ghosts that lived in memory rather than carved wood. Astrid moved through the cabin like an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. Here was the shelf where she had kept her meager possessions. There was the corner where she had sat through long winter nights, wrestling with visions that flowed through Yggdrasil's network. Everything remained exactly as she had left it, preserved in the amber of abandonment. But she was no longer the broken woman who had fled here after losing her shield sisters. That Astrid had seen only 2 choices: human weakness or inhuman power, mortal limitation or cosmic responsibility. She had built walls between herself and the world, convinced that isolation was the price of remaining herself. The woman who stood in this cabin now understood that false dichotomies led only to false solutions. She could be human and powerful, mortal and responsible, connected to cosmic forces without being consumed by them. The key lay not in avoiding choice, but in choosing wisely, moment by moment, whenever the easy path revealed itself. A sound from outside drew her attention, voices approaching through the pine forest. Astrid tensed instinctively, her hand moving toward the sacks at her belt. Too soon for the berserkers to have returned with reinforcements, but others might have learned of recent events in the grove. But these voices carried familiar cadences, speaking her native tongue with accents she recognized. Through the cabin's single window, she glimpsed figures moving between the trees, not raiders or religious fanatics, but travelers bearing the worn leather and practical weapons of her own people. "Astrid?" The call came from someone she had thought never to see again. "Astrid Ironwill, are you here?" She stepped outside to find Eric Stormdancer standing in her clearing, flanked by 3 other warriors she remembered from her Shieldmaiden days. They looked older, weathered by years of campaigning, but their eyes still held the steady courage that had made them legends among their people. "Eric," her voice caught on his name. "How did you find me?" The grizzled warrior smiled, though worry lines creased his weathered features. "Strange tales have been spreading through the northern settlements. A hermit woman who spoke with spirits, wolves that fought like heroes, berserkers who returned from the deep woods, speaking of power freely given up rather than claimed." He studied her face with the careful attention of someone reading a battlefield. "You look different. Changed, but more yourself than when you disappeared." Astrid felt tears threatening, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen clearly by someone who had known her before loss reshaped her world. "I've learned some difficult truths about strength and responsibility." "The world has need of such lessons," Eric replied gravely. "Strange storms have been ravaging the coastal settlements. Creatures from the deep woods venture where they never dared before. The old seers speak of imbalances that require a guardian's touch." He gestured toward her wooden leg with respectful recognition. "We've come to ask for help, not demand it." Astrid looked down at Fenris and Skadi, who watched the newcomers with alert but non-threatening attention. These wolves would never be supernatural guardians, but they were her family now. Chosen companions who offered simple loyalty without the complex weight of magical compulsion. "I can't promise to solve everything," she said finally. "But I won't hide from my responsibilities anymore. If the world needs a guardian who chooses to remain human, then that's what I'll try to be." The return to her old life was complete, not as retreat into familiar patterns, but as transformation made manifest, the new beginning. Spring came early that year, melting the last snows from the mountain passes and painting the valleys with wildflowers that bloomed in impossible profusion. Astrid stood on the hillside overlooking Ravensgard, the coastal settlement that had become her new home, watching fishing boats return with their morning catch while Fenris and Scotty dozed in the warm sunshine beside her. 6 months had passed since Eric and his warriors had found her in the abandoned cabin. 6 months of learning to balance cosmic responsibility with human community, of protecting without dominating, of serving without hiding. The transition had been far from smooth. There had been storms to calm with careful applications of power, creatures from the deep woods to negotiate with rather than destroy, and skeptical jarls who needed convincing that a crippled Shieldmaiden could serve as guardian without becoming tyrant. But gradually, steadily, a new pattern had emerged. Astrid lived simply in a small house at the settlement's edge, close enough to respond when needed but far enough to maintain the solitude that kept her grounded. The wolves had adapted to village life with surprising grace, becoming beloved fixtures who played with children and helped fishermen mend their nets. No one spoke of their true nature. Wolves were simply wolves, offering companionship without the complex weight of supernatural obligation. "Astrid!" Young Ingvar's voice carried across the hillside, breathless with excitement rather than alarm. The baker's son had appointed himself her unofficial messenger, delighting in the responsibility of keeping their guardian informed about village affairs. "Ships on the horizon, flying Jarl Magnus's banner." She smiled, recognizing the careful way he delivered news these days. After the first few weeks of panicked summons for every minor crisis, the villagers had learned to distinguish between genuine threats and ordinary challenges. Magnus's arrival meant politics rather than peril, negotiations that required wisdom rather than power. "Tell him I'll be down shortly," she called back, watching Ingvar race toward the harbor with the boundless energy of youth. The wolves stirred at her voice, amber eyes opening to assess whether their pack required movement. Astrid remained on the hillside for a few more moments, feeling the steady pulse of Yggdrasil's network through her wooden leg. Information flowed like a distant river, storms gathering beyond the western islands, raiders moving through territories 3 days' sail north, a sickness in the great forest that spoke to imbalances requiring careful attention. Not the overwhelming torrent that had once threatened to wash away her humanity, but a manageable current of awareness that informed without consuming. The key lay in choosing which currents to follow, which responsibilities to embrace directly, and which to influence through subtler means. She had learned to trust others with their own struggles, offering guidance rather than solutions, strength rather than dominion. Magnus's visit concerned the spring trading routes. Strange weather patterns had disrupted traditional passages, while creatures displaced from their usual territories posed new hazards to merchant vessels. The other jarls wanted guarantees of safe passage, assurances that their guardian could protect commerce without interfering in their affairs. It was exactly the kind of delicate balance that had once seemed impossible, using cosmic power in service of mundane concerns, remaining approachably human while wielding forces that could reshape reality. The old Astrid would have seen only stark choices, hide from responsibility or be consumed by it. The woman walking down the hillside understood that wisdom lay in the space between extremes. "Come on," she murmured to the wolves, who rose with lazy stretches and fell into step beside her. Time to prove again that guardians can remain mortal. The village bustled with afternoon activity as she approached the harbor. Children played between drying nets while their mothers sorted the morning catch. Men repaired boats with the careful attention of people whose lives depended on their craft. Everyone acknowledged her passage with comfortable familiarity, a nod here, a greeting there, the easy recognition extended to valued neighbors rather than distant protectors. At the harbor, Magnus's longship was already moored alongside the fishing boats, its crew mingling with locals in the universal language of shared ale and competing stories. The Jarl himself stood deep in conversation with Eric, their weathered faces grave with the particular concern of leaders confronting challenges beyond simple solutions. Magnus raised his hand in greeting as she approached, his voice carrying genuine warmth beneath the formal courtesy. Eric tells me the southern passages are clear again. The sea sprites have returned to their deep waters? They were never hostile, she replied, settling onto a nearby crate while the wolves arranged themselves at her feet. Just displaced by changes in the deep currents, we reached an understanding that serves everyone's needs. What she didn't mention was the week of careful negotiations conducted through dreams and tidal pools, the delicate balance required to address the sprite's concerns without disrupting human commerce. Some victories were too complex for easy explanation, requiring trust rather than detailed justification. Magnus nodded, studying her with the shrewd attention of someone who understood that simple answers often masked complex solutions. The other Jarls speak highly of your methods. Unusual for a guardian to be so. He paused, searching for the right words. Human? Astrid suggested with gentle humor. Present, he corrected, available for conversation rather than pronouncement. It's a rare gift among those who wield such power. The afternoon sun slanted lower as they discussed trade routes and seasonal challenges, the comfortable give and take of practical people solving practical problems. This was what Astrid had never imagined possible during her years of exile, being simultaneously guardian and neighbor, protector and participant in the ordinary business of human community. As Magnus's ship prepared to depart with the evening tide, Eric lingered on the dock while his companions loaded final supplies. The old warrior's expression carried a thoughtfulness that spoke of deeper currents than trade negotiations. Something troubles you, Astrid observed, scratching Scotty behind the ears as the wolf pressed against her leg with drowsy contentment. The opposite, actually. Eric's smile held surprised recognition. I've spent decades watching leaders consumed by their responsibilities, jarls who forget they were once farmers' sons, skalds who believe their own songs, berserkers who lose themselves in the blood fury. He gestured toward the bustling harbor, where ordinary life continued its ancient rhythms. But you found something different. Power that serves rather than rules. It gives an old man hope for the future. Astrid felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with unexpected praise, the moment of recognition that she had indeed found her way to something worth protecting. Not perfect solutions or eternal peace, but the simple possibility of choosing correctly when choices mattered most. The world still has its monsters, she said quietly, watching fishing boats return with the day's final catch. But perhaps it also has proof that power need not become monstrous. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the settlement and cooking fires painted windows with warm light, Astrid sat outside her small house watching the stars emerge in crystalline clarity. Fenris sprawled across her feet with the boneless relaxation of a well-fed wolf, while Scotty patrolled the garden boundaries with the patient thoroughness of a creature protecting what it loved. Through Yggdrasil's network, she could sense the vast tapestry of existence stretching across 9 realms, storms and wars, births and deaths, the endless cycle of creation and destruction that defined all living things. Her wooden leg ached with phantom pain that spoke to connections both severed and maintained, powers chosen rather than seized. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose wisely when easier paths revealed themselves. There would be storms to calm and conflicts to mediate, the ongoing work of remaining human while serving something larger than purely human concerns. But tonight, there was starlight and simple companionship, and the profound satisfaction of having found her way home to herself. Astrid closed her eyes and listened to the wolves breathing beside her, to the distant sound of waves against the harbor stones, to the quiet music of a community at peace. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that strength measured itself not in what it could take, but in what it chose to give. That the greatest victory was remaining yourself while becoming who you were meant to be. In the distance, a fishing boat's lantern bobbed on dark water, carrying its crew safely home.